Old houses were not built naively. They were built by folks who had no access to electric appliances, no synthetic vapor barriers, and no modern HVAC systems, yet they managed to keep homes standing for centuries without mold overtaking walls or rot destroying structural timbers. The reason is simple and, honestly, often misunderstood. Moisture was controlled through air movement, temperature differences, and seasonal cold, not by sealing homes tight and mechanically extracting water. Cold air was not an enemy to be fought, but a tool deliberately used to preserve the house itself. Battlefield survival. What modern homeowners often see as drafty was, in reality, a moisture management system refined over generations. If you understand how this worked, you can apply the same logic today, whether you live in an old farmhouse, a cabin, or a modern home struggling with condensation and mold. Cold air reduced moisture because it lowered absolute humidity rather than trapping it indoors. Cold air holds less moisture than warm air. This is a basic physical reality that older builders understood through observation, not textbooks. When cold outside air was allowed to circulate through a house, especially during winter, it diluted humid indoor air and carried moisture out through constant exchange. Instead of trying to dry the air mechanically, they replaced it with air that simply could not hold as much water. This mattered most in winter, when cooking, breathing, and washing introduced moisture daily. Old homes allowed cold air to seep in at lower points and warmer air to rise and escape through upper vents, chimneys, and loose roof structures. This slow, continuous airflow prevented humidity from ever reaching the levels needed for mold growth. Moisture never had time to accumulate. A practical application today is simple and often overlooked. During cold, dry weather, controlled ventilation can outperform a dehumidifier. Opening opposing windows for short periods, allowing stack effect airflow, can drop indoor humidity dramatically without electricity. In older homes, keeping basement vents open in winter often reduces dampness instead of worsening it, because cold air suppresses moisture rather than feeding it. Old foundations were designed to breathe rather than block moisture entirely. Stone, brick, and lime mortar foundations were intentionally porous. Moisture was expected to enter the structure, but it was also expected to leave. Cold air moving through crawl spaces and basements accelerated evaporation and prevented standing dampness. Builders understood that water trapped was water that caused damage. They knew, that old stone and brick foundations were made to breathe. Their porous nature let moisture escape, instead of getting stuck inside and causing trouble. Modern waterproofing, it often traps moisture behind concrete walls or plastic vapor barriers, and that just creates ideal conditions for mold. Old homes avoided this by letting temperature differences drive moisture outward. Cold air moving along those foundation walls condensed less water than warm, stagnant air ever could. Any moisture that did get in, it could evaporate slowly and safely. For today's prepper or restoration-minded homeowner, the lesson here is, restraint. Sealing an old basement up tight usually makes moisture problems worse, not better. Allowing seasonal airflow, using breathable materials, and steering clear of plastic barriers in historic structures helps preserve both the building and the air quality. Cold air, it's not a threat when it can move. Fireplaces and chimneys acted as moisture exhaust systems year-round. Even when they weren't being used, chimneys created this upward airflow. Warm indoor air naturally rose and exited through the flues, which pulled in cooler air from below. This continuous draw kept humidity low and, surfaces dry. In winter, this effect really intensified as the temperature differences increased. Old homes often had multiple chimneys, not just for heating, but for air movement. Kitchens, parlors, and bedrooms each had a vertical escape path for moisture-laden air. Dehumidifiers were unnecessary because, humidity rarely stagnated. So, Applying this today means, well, understanding vertical airflow. Using passive vents, roof vents, or even, those old unused flues can help recreate this effect. In off-grid or low-power scenarios, passive ventilation becomes downright critical. Opening upper-level vents while letting cold air in at ground level kind of mimics a centuries-old system that doesn't need any electricity and, honestly, just about never fails. Cold air slowed biological activity that destroys buildings. Mold, rot, and insects, they all thrive in warm, damp environments. But cold air, it suppresses all three. Older homes stayed cooler overall, especially in winter, and that made a huge difference in reducing biological decay. Timber frames survived centuries not because they were sealed up tight, but because they stayed dry and cool. That's really the key. So, modern heating strategies, well, they keep the whole house nice and uniformly warm, even in those rooms nobody ever uses. But, that ends up increasing biological activity all over. Back in the day, old houses let certain areas stay cold. Think attics, basements, and storage rooms. Those chilly zones actually served as preservation spaces, both for the building itself and for whatever folks stored there. From a survivalist point of view, this really matters a lot. Letting those unused spaces get cold during winter saves on fuel and keeps materials in good shape. Root cellars, cold pantries, and unheated storage rooms aren't just old-fashioned ideas. They're tried-and-true preservation tools that work because cold air naturally limits all that moisture-driven decay. Older households, well, they'd adjust how they use their homes with the seasons. They'd close off rooms, keep the heat where it was needed, and stick to a smaller area for daily living. That way, they kept moisture levels down in most of the house, and the cold air could settle in those unused spaces. This practice reduced condensation on walls and windows and prevented dampness from spreading. Instead of fighting cold air everywhere, they managed where warmth was needed. Moisture stayed localized and manageable. Applying this today is straightforward. Zone heating, closing off unused rooms, and reducing moisture generation in colder areas can significantly cut mold risk. A prepper mindset already values efficiency, and this approach aligns perfectly with long-term resilience. Dehumidifiers exist because modern homes trap moisture. Airtight construction, plastic barriers, and constant heating remove airflow while increasing humidity. Old homes avoided this problem by design. In modern homes, we see a lot of moisture issues that folks try to fix with dehumidifiers, but if you look at old homes, they manage moisture naturally, without all these gadgets. Cold air was never really meant to be comfortable, it was meant to be functional. It kept materials dry, kept structures intact, and honestly made living spaces healthier. Folks managed the discomfort with clothing, a bit of localized heat, and, just changing up their habits with the seasons, instead of relying on machines. So, for anyone out there restoring an old house or thinking about building something resilient, the lesson isn't to just toss out modern tools, but to understand why you need them in the first place. Most times, if you restore proper airflow and keep temperatures balanced, you can cut back or even skip the mechanical drying altogether. This knowledge remains relevant for preparedness and long-term resilience. In grid-down scenarios, dehumidifiers become useless overnight, but passive moisture control does not. Cold air, airflow, and breathable construction materials keep on working without power and without failure. Now, this is why old homes manage to survive wars, depressions, and those long winters with just minimal intervention. Understanding how cold air was used intentionally lets you design homes, cabins, and shelters that naturally resist moisture. It also helps you maintain existing structures more intelligently and, avoid those costly mistakes that come from modern assumptions. This isn't just nostalgia. Nope, it's applied historical knowledge that's got real-world value even today. So, If this kind of deep, practical history matters to you, go ahead and subscribe to Warfield Prepper Chronicles and share this guide with others who care about preserving real knowledge. These lessons were hard-earned and honestly, they're worth keeping alive.